Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Bill Nighy pursues a precursor to Jack the Ripper who calls themselves the Limehouse Golem. Set in 1880s London, a grisly series of murders in the area of Limehouse has captured the bloodlust of the public, with the killer being nicknamed the Limehouse Golem, and Inspector Kildare, played by Bill Nighy, has been placed in charge of the investigation on his first murder case. Kildare soon deduces four suspects: Douglas Boo's Dan Leno, Henry Goodman's Karl Marx, Morgan Watkins' George Gissing, and Sam Reed's John Cree. The latter has just died, and his wife Lizzie, played by Olivia Cooke, stands on trial for his poisoning, but Kildare is determined to prove that her husband was the Golem and save her from the gallows. The Limehouse Golem is based on Peter Ackroyd's 1994 novel Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, which is a fictional tale that incorporates real historical figures, and has been adapted for the screen by Jane Goldman, whose name should be very familiar to film fans, as she's previously adapted the likes of Kingsman, Kick-Ass, and The Woman in Black for the screen, and was apparently a fan of the source material even before she got into screenwriting. Sadly, the film was originally set to star Alan Rickman in the role of Kildare, and by all accounts he was very involved in the pre-production process and developing that character, but sadly, due to his declining health, he had to pull out of the role and Bill Nighy replaced him. And Nighy is excellent, but I do admit that there were points in this movie where I did wonder how Rickman would have played this role, because it's not the sort of part that you were traditionally associated with him, and the film is actually dedicated to the late actor, who is very much missed. I came to the Limehouse Golem expecting a Victorian murder mystery about a proto-Jack the Ripper, which this movie is technically about, but I would argue it's so much more than simply just that, to the point where I'd even maybe say that it's been undersold. It's not simply about Nighy's Kildare trying to track down a killer. He's but one of two main characters, and the other is Olivia Cooke's Lizzie, who is a woman on trial for the murder of her husband, and so much of it takes the point of view of her flashbacks that she recounts to Kildare that are very much interwoven with the case of the Golem, because her husband is a major suspect in the case. And Olivia Cooke is the real standout of this film, I would argue. She really impressed me in this film. I've seen her in other things like Ouija, for example, but this really shows what a tremendously talented young actress she is, especially because this is such a complicated, very nuanced part that gives her a lot to play, and she really seizes it with both hands, and she's brilliant in this film. She genuinely is. But these flashbacks very much set the world and the major themes of the film, which is crucially that of theatricality and performance, because that is where Lizzie comes from. She is an actress, and she essentially finds her place in the world with what are essentially outcasts and misfits from society that have managed to turn themselves into clowns and performers for the public, and are allowed to express themselves in a way that Victorian society doesn't really allow elsewhere, by performing these very, at times quite base, quite grotesque performances, but they managed to make a name for themselves because of that. And that's where Dan Leno comes in. Dan Leno was a real historical figure and actor, and he's played in the film by Douglas Booth, who again is an excellent performance here. He's very memorable in this part, and he especially manages to strike up a friendship with Lizzie as a character, because Lizzie, she comes from a very damaged background. She was abused as a child. Leno is known as a Dane performer in that he's a male actor, but he would perform in women roles, and he strikes a friendship with Lizzie, who does the same in the reverse, in that she's a woman but she prefers to play male parts. And in the case of Lizzie, because of her abuse, she likes to cut an asexual figure to a certain degree, to the point where she'll even wear her costumes off stage rather than try to blend in. And these themes of sexuality and gender identity, which are incorporated in the major concept of theatricality and performance, these were concepts that I didn't expect the movie to cover. I didn't really anticipate the movie going in that direction, so when it did, I was very impressed by that, and especially by the way the film handles it, because I think it makes Lizzie a very compelling character. I don't think I've honestly seen a lot of characters like Lizzie, and I think she, as a character, is probably the most fascinating of them all, simply because that very much defines her through the entire film and very much has lasting repercussions. But even though she does try to desexualize herself in a lot of ways, she still finds herself being the object of affection for playwright John Cree, who's played by Sam Reed, who will go on to be her husband. This character of John Cree is again tied in with these ideas of sexuality and gender politics, in that he feels that he is a white knight, as it were, in that he wants to rescue her from this low theatrical world, in that they are essentially the comics of the day, but the film touches upon these ideas of fame and notoriety as you would expect for a film set in the world of actors and performance, in that there was a line that really struck with me, in that some names are carved in stone and others in ice, and the idea that because they're, comic performers, they're going to be forgotten. That's the idea of the presence of Dan Leno, who was very popular back in the day, but is maybe a lesser known figure now, as it were. And so you have this playwright John Cree. He's offered Lizzie a role in the play that he's writing, but once he manages to attain his prize, he's very much less than chivalrous. And the movie is very critical of men this way, men that like to cast women in this role as objects to be saved and to be possessed, and then once they have their way with them, they don't really need them anymore. They just want to attain them. They don't actually have any romantic passion for them. And again, that was one of those areas that made me so engaged with the story, because it was one of those things that I hadn't anticipated the film going in. And this world of theatre that we spend so much of the film in very much establishes this very heightened, very gothic and atmospheric view of Victorian London, and one that reverberates off of in really fascinating and unexpected ways, such as how the Golem in their writings talks about the killings as their own kind of spectacle, and one meant for the people of London that are morbidly fascinated by them and deliberately designed to stoke their bloodlust to a certain degree, that they are attracted to them because of the violence of them. It's no accident that the Golem's most significant crime is a copycat on the exact location that it happened. And I think the film is deliberately trying to court comparisons with our own modern media cycle, and trying to say that in some respects maybe things haven't really changed all that much. Kildare arrives at the crime scene and he's surrounded by reporters, all vying for questions, all wanting some lurid piece of information to deliver to their readers. And later on he attends a performance with Dan Leno about the Limehouse killings, and that in itself drew my mind to compare it to TV movies that are based on real-life court cases, such as those like the ones about O.J. Simpson, for example, that very much try to cash in and exploit those events for their own gain. And I think the film is deliberately trying to compare those sort of ideas. That's exactly what the Golem wants. The Golem is deliberately trying to be infamous, to be notorious, and this spectacle very much allows them to try and transcend into legend, and Kildare has to try and cut through that to a certain degree. And this is again the idea of everything's a stage, the whole world is a stage. And that's everything about this movie is all about that, even in smaller forms. That brings us nicely to Bill Nighy's Kildare, who finds himself cast in his own role, namely that of the patsy. You see, this is Kildare's very first murder investigation, and the only reason he's been given that is because the police's star detective has moved the case onto him, believing it can't be solved and not wanting to sully his reputation. So Kildare finds himself very much thrust on a public stage and made accountable for finding the killer, and very much aware that he is a scapegoat if he fails. This is a bit different from Nighy's normal roles, because normally Nighy plays these quite eccentric characters, but here he's very much a straight-laced, by-the-book detective, and he's very much determined, not just because he wants to find the killer, but he has something to prove. He's been given this enormous opportunity, even in spite of the fact that it's something of a poisoned chalice, because while it could have damaging consequences for his career, it could also have very positive ones. And it seems like over the years he's been stymied by rumours about him. That idea of sexuality shows its head once again when the constable who has been assigned to the case, played by Daniel Mays, the constable's name is Flood, he's told that Kildare is not the marrying kind, if you get my drift. And apparently that has been an obstacle to his career for a very long time. And Kildare eventually comes to form a relationship with Lizzie, and I think it's because in many ways they're quite similar. Both of them are considered outcasts within their world, and both of them have been vilified by the media. Kildare for his handling of the Golem case, Lizzie for the murder of her husband that she stands accused of. And I think on that level they relate to each other, but I think it's also because Kildare is aware that both of them have a noose over their heads. Kildare's is metaphorical, but Lizzie's is very much real, and I think that mobilises him in a lot of ways, because he's aware that his failure doesn't just affect him, it affects the life of this woman as well, and he doesn't want that on his conscience. And as such, Nighy's performance, it's very quietly driven. It's not a very showy performance. It's one that very much builds throughout the film. When the film does its big reveal at the end, I think that's the effect of the role can really be made clear at that point. It's just that because Cook and the theatrical storyline is a lot showier than the framing device, I think Nighy can get pushed a little bit too much to the background. I think if I did have a complaint about the movie, although the world that Lizzie inhabits is fascinating, those flashbacks do have a tendency to move the actual Golem case into the background to a certain extent. And while the Golem investigation isn't the most interesting part of the movie, it does rob the film a little bit of its narrative drive to a certain extent. But one thing I did find interesting about the investigation into who the Golem was is, of course, they have the writing by the Golem, and they have all these suspects, because the Golem had written in a book at the London Public Library, and there were 4 people at the time, and they're all suspects. And so Kildare has to go to each of them to try and get a handwriting sample and question them. And when he gets them to read out the extracts, we see the murders and the accounts that the Golem has written performed by each of the suspects. And I thought that was interesting as well, because it's almost like Kildare is casting the role of the Golem in his mind. He's trying to imagine them in the part. And so if you've ever wanted to see Karl Marx drenched in, freshly spilled claret talking about murdering people, this is the movie for you. And I think this is deliberately meant to have a little bit of dark humour about it. Again, it's that heightened theatricality of it. It gives this movie a very kind of warped feel in certain regards. But I just found that to be a very intriguing technique to use to show us this flashback structure, but from various different perspectives. I found The Limehouse Golem to be a really pleasant surprise, especially considering I didn't have the highest of expectations for it, but this is a very well written, exceptionally well acted piece of drama. You've got a phenomenal British cast, the likes of Nighy, Cook, Booth, Eddie Marzan, who is one of our great character actors, and it's very tautly directed by Juan Carlos Medina. This is very well paced, especially for a period drama where your mind does have a tendency to wander, but here, because the characters and the themes of the story are so engaging, I was compelled all the way through to the end. And if anything I've said about this movie makes you want to check it out, I'd insist you do so. Go seek this movie out. I don't think it's been given the widest of releases, unfortunately, and I think it may lead to it being overlooked, but this is a really great little mystery movie if you're a fan of that kind of genre. Go hunt this one down. The Limehouse Golem is a very well-made murder mystery that should keep you engaged and guessing all the way through. While delving into the bawdy theatrical world of its time gives the film a macabre energy and gothic atmosphere, what makes Golem so interesting and compelling is the richness of its characters and the film's themes in Jane Goldman's adapted script. Cook especially shines here in a complicated role that carries the film just as much as Nighy does, who steps into the late Alan Rickman's shoes as the thoughtful but emotionally sensitive detective. This is a case that definitely has more substance, colour and intrigue than many others of its ilk, and as such is worth investigating. If you like this review, you can investigate my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out. Here we